that whatever they're doing that's important, they will spend as much as they need to get it done. But in terms of the people resources, which are even more important than money, it's very hard to get people assigned to a topic because they treat resources as very precious and they only focus on a few things at a time. And the atmosphere is that we need to get more done with less, even though they're a big company. And finally, of course, is back to this issue of mission, that the people at Apple feel like they're at a company that has a mission, and that helps drive them. And that's also very much true of startups. Now, I want to move to another important question that's not as often asked, is not just what can we learn from Israel, but equally as important is how can we work with Israel. Now, because every country has its own strengths. Israel is not very good at building big companies. In fact, we're pretty bad at it. We're very good at startups. Other countries are very good at building big companies, and they're not so good at startups. And just like not everybody grows every kind of food and not everybody builds every kind of, each country has its comparative advantage. And so a lot of the question of how to become more innovative has to do not so much with copying Israel, but is simply joining forces and working together. Now, there's something strange going on here. If you look at the foreign direct investment in Israel, which is basically the R&D centers, the Intels, the Microsoft, Googles, and so on, 80% of that is coming from the United States, 20% from the rest of the world. This makes no sense. Some of it can be explained by the fact that American companies are more tech-oriented. But that can't explain a disparity of 80% for the US and 20% for all of Asia, Europe, Latin America, and so on. So there's something funny going on, is that the American companies have discovered that they can inject themselves with innovation by partnering with Israeli companies, by either buying Israeli startups or building Israeli R&D centers. And in fact, what American companies have discovered is this natural synergy between big companies and small companies. Jeff Immelt, who's of course the CEO of General Electric, was recently in Israel. He'd been to Israel a few times before, but not as CEO. And what he said, his message to the Israelis was essentially, you guys are great at innovation. We're great at scaling up. We're great at making things big. You bring us the innovations and we'll scale them up. And this has been the partnership between American companies and Israeli companies. And it's worked very well. It's made the American companies more innovative. It's made the Israeli companies able to get to the markets and to do what they have no idea how to do. Israeli companies are great at going from $0 to $100 million. But they have no idea how to go from $100 million to $1 billion. And what's more, they don't want to. You know, just now, again, at this event I was at yesterday in Israel, I was sitting next to Yair Goldfinger, one of the founders of ICIC, one of the great startups in Israeli history. In fact, it was one of the great startups, I think globally. It was very important in the history of the internet because it was the first company that essentially showed how you could go viral. And in that way, it was kind of a precursor for Facebook and for Twitter and for Groupon. ICIC had phenomenal growth with no advertising. They went viral over the internet, and they were also the symbolic company. They were bought by AOL in 1996 for $400 million, and they were started by a few kids, and they had no revenue at that time when they were bought. So they were the emblematic story of the bubble, but also of the beginning of the internet age. And one of the founders was sitting next to me, and he's since become an investor in many startups and started another company. And he was saying how this new company is now doing very well, and it's time for him to get out of it. And actually, he said he would like to build it into a big company, but his investors, they wanted to sell. So he'll do another startup. And this is the typical thing, is Israeli entrepreneurs go from startup to startup, and that's what they like doing. And they're not so good at building big companies. So for that, Israel needs to work with companies around the world, and companies around the world need to work with Israel. Now I want to talk about the word miracle in the title. And there are really two miracles here, particularly in Korea. Whoops, that didn't display very well. Korea started out in 1953 with a life expectancy of 49. Israel at that time had a life expectancy of 66. Korea's per capita income was about $1,000, and Israel's was about 4 times that back in 1953. So that's the starting point. Today in 2009, you can't read the numbers there, but Korea and Israel are almost exactly the same, both in life expectancy and income per capita. And here you can see it graphically. This is from gapminder.com. The red line is Korea, starting in 1953. You can see this is life expectancy on the left and income per person on the bottom. You can see where Korea started much poorer and lower life expectancy than Israel in 1953, and how in this same amount of time, in 2009, Korea has caught up completely to Israel by growing much faster and for the same amount of time. And that's a miracle. I mean, to be able to do this with a much larger population than Israel. I know that you think of yourselves as a small country to some degree, but for us, you're a big country. You have almost 10 times the population of Israel. And also, you've been faced with adversity. I mean, Korea does not have a lot of natural resources. Korea has had this huge national security problem to its north that started at the very beginning and has continued throughout its history, just like Israel. And so this kind of adversity, I think, has helped both our countries create miracles. Now, I just want to end with a couple points that relate to what's next for the Startup Nation, and also about what this means for, let's think of ourselves both as small countries, for Korea and for Israel, about a new model going forward that's very exciting. Later this year, I'm going to be able to buy an electric car and drive it anywhere in the country. And this is a system that's being created by a company called Better Place that is actually headquartered in the US, but founded by an Israeli, and all of the R&D is being done in Israel, that's creating electric car infrastructure that will allow Israel to actually replace the gas car with electric cars. And Israel is going to do this on a national level. Shai Agassi, the founder of Better Place, calls Israel, for his purposes, a beta country, a place to implement a solution that is exportable to the whole world. He basically is trying to say, how can we get one country off of oil? How can we solve this global problem? If we could get one country off of oil, we could all get off of oil. And Israel is going to be the first country to get off of oil by replacing the gas car. Denmark is doing this about the same time. Australia is going to do this next, which will show that it's not just small countries that can do this model. China is very seriously moving in this direction with electric cars on the Better Place model, which is a system based on swappable batteries. You can drive into a swap station if you need to go beyond the range of the battery and change the battery in 1 minute without getting out of the car, get a full battery. This is the key to the system. And to me, this is an example of how a small country can tackle a global problem, can have a global impact in dealing with global problems. And I hope that Israel does this with other global problems, like education. You know, the Korean test scores in math and science, I'm sure, are higher than in Israel. We have a problem with test scores in Israel. And yet, the countries with high test scores, you know, like Singapore, like Korea, they feel like their educational system also needs work. In fact, I think that the whole world has an educational problem. Whether you have high test scores or not so high test scores, the world of education needs to be reinvented. You have great universities, we have great universities, but we're only at the beginning of a wave of innovation in education, and I very much hope that Israel tries to lead that wave as well, and the same with health, with water, with other global problems. So I think this is an exciting prospect for Israel. I think there's a tremendous amount of potential, both going in this direction of solving global problems, also in terms of exporting other kinds of innovation, not just technology, also business model innovation. Better Place, for example, it's got a lot of technology in it, but basically it's a business model innovation. The Strauss Company, an Israeli company, not a high-tech company, it makes food in Israel, sells consumer products. They're selling coffee in Brazil. That's like selling oil to the Saudis. And there's no technology in that. That's a business model innovation. Same with globalization is a tremendous, I think, export for Israel. Israel's good at globalization not because we're such geniuses, but because we come from such a tiny country. In Israel, if you start a company, you basically can't depend on the local market, which is tiny. You're shut off from the regional market, so you have to think globally from the beginning. So we've become very good at globalization, and there are many examples of what Israel has had to offer. For example, there was a Chinese company bought an Israeli pesticides and fertilizer company just recently. They didn't buy it for the technology. I think they bought it because the Israeli company was working in 100 countries around the world. So this was a way for the Chinese company to instantly globalize. And China, actually, I think Korea is better at globalization than the Chinese. And that because you're a smaller country, a much smaller country, that helps you think globally. And you're sort of in between compared to Israel. I mean, you have a decent local market, and you certainly have a regional market. But you also think in terms of a small country in that you have to think more globally than, say, a Chinese company. And that's an advantage. Sometimes being small is an advantage. And so I think there's tremendous room for cooperation going forward between Korea and Israel, that we can both take advantage of this natural synergy between small companies and big companies, and that we can teach each other how both to be innovative and to scale up and to change the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Salsinger, for your wonderful remark. The speaker shared with us the valuable ideas on the Israelis' economic success and the growth, and he also shared with us the valuable lessons that we can learn all from. The second keynote speech will be presented by the distinguished Professor Scott Stern of the MIT